And finally, for the speaker part, Usha Lee McFarling of the LA Times, after which we'll have a discussion and all the panelists will come up.
Hi. Well, you've heard all these really clear and lucid presentations on things that are happening on the edges of the Earth, and it seems like it'd be a simple matter to convey that to the public and get them interested in climate change. But that's clearly not happening. I think the climate change story has been told sporadically. I think the story is very muddy and confusing to general readers, and sometimes the stories are dramatically wrong. And what I wanted to talk about, since I'm not a scientist, is some of my thinking on why the coverage of climate change has been so poor. I think it's one of the most poorly covered areas, not just in science journalism, but in journalism today. One of the main reasons it really falls between cracks of traditional coverage areas. I'm a science writer, and I write about scientific research, so I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing for me to be covering it. But it involves, earth science, ocean science, atmospheric science. It involves ecology, wildlife studies, and even increasingly public health as disease rates change in response to climate change. We have different reporters covering those different areas, so it's not just one person. It's also clearly an environmental story, so that's another set of people who cover that. It's a business story when you talk about auto manufacturing and use of fossil fuels, and that's a whole different desk. It's a White House story when you talk about what the Bush administration is or perhaps isn't doing about climate change. So then our Washington Bureau wants to get involved. It's a foreign story when there's big agreements to be signed in Kyoto or Bonn, and then the foreign correspondents want to get involved. It's increasingly becoming a regional story as the sort of forecasts of how climate change will affect different regions of the country become more precise. So in California, it's become a big issue about where we're going to get water as our permanent ice in the Sierra continues to disappear. So you would think that given that almost any beat touches on climate change, it would be covered well. But what I've seen instead is that it falls between the cracks, and what you just don't have in most places. You don't have any one person taking ownership of it and saying, "This is my story. I'm going to cover it." So you get flashes of coverage. When a huge iceberg calves, that's on every newspaper in the country, but you just don't see the day-to-day coverage. And, you just don't see that in any other areas. You don't have the City Hall reporter going, "I'm just not going to cover the City Council this week." Or, a newspaper saying, "Well, this serial killer isn't that interesting. We'll cover all the other ones, but not this one." But in climate change, it somehow seems to be okay. No one's really minding the store. A second issue is this area of uncertainty, and I think Sarah's presentation covered some of that. There's a lot of clear signals. There's dramatic change, and why we focus on the Arctic and the Antarctic is that's where it's most visible. A few degrees of change is the difference between ice and water. I mean, if you see at the, in the area of the Northwest Passage, that landscape for thousands of miles is getting dramatically altered. And you see, obvious clear signal in how much carbon dioxide we're putting out. But it's just not, most scientists just can't say 100% that human impact is causing these changes. In the Arctic and Antarctic, we also have these very large decadal scale changes in atmosphere. There's the Arctic Oscillation as one. There's another one called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And these can drastically change atmospheric patterns for decades, and that in turn changes temperature regimes, changes ocean circulation, and that in turn, might alter if ice continues to just circulate around the pole and clump up there and become this very thick, dramatic multi-year ice, or if it's exported down the side of Greenland and eventually melts. And they're just beginning to get a handle on what these patterns are. And those overlaid on the human impact has led to some dramatic change in the Arctic and Antarctic, but people are not quite sure if it's going to continue the way it is or if it'll come back a little bit. And I think that kind of complexity makes for a murkier story, and one that's harder to tell in the constraints that most of us face in either newspapering or broadcasting, and even in magazines increasingly. It makes for a story that editors like a clean story. They want you to they want you to tell them in 2 sentences what your story's about so they can decide whether to put it on the front page. And you can't talk about the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that easily in 2 sentences. I think readers also start to tune out that uncertainty and start to wonder if they should care. It's, you know, it's not clear, it's confusing. I also think there's a danger if we don't key in that uncertainty, and I'd actually be interested in James' experiences with the New York Pole and the New York Times and the North Pole is melting story, because that was quite controversial and led to a very public correction of the story. I think the uncertainty, though, has allowed minority viewpoints on climate change to sort of hijack the journalistic doctrine of fairness. And this is, I guess most of your writers know, is if you give one side of the story, you have to give the other side. So I'd say until the past, like, year and a half or 2 years ago, when climate coverage started getting a little more sophisticated, you would have a scientist saying, well, sea ice has thinned and, you know, carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere. We think there's a human impact to climate change. And then there'd be equal weight in the story given to some spokesman for, you know, the coalition of oil interests or whatever. They have more, you know, subtle names than that, saying, well, we don't think it's happening. You know, we think it's because of, you know, volcanoes or solar forcing. And you know, it's true you have to be fair and give both sides of an issue, but, you know, increasingly now I think we've got National Academy of Sciences reports, and you probably have 90% of scientists agreeing that dramatic climate change is happening and human impact plays a large role in that. And you have a few dissenters who are largely funded by the industry saying it's not. So to me, the responsible, fair story is to put those comments in context. And give an objective viewpoint, but one that's not, you know, 50-50 or what we in the trade call he said, she said journalism, which just is a cacophony of sort of noise of one side versus the other, and it leaves the reader throwing up their hand and saying, you know, why should I even care about this at all? And I guess finally, I think a problem is that the story's incremental. Like all science, there's small studies, and they build up into larger studies, and those build up into a body of agreement. But the newspaper coverage doesn't have a lot of tolerance for that. So what you see are the dramatic stories covered, the calving of the icebergs, you know, malaria rising in high latitude areas of Africa, and then these things stick with the public. What you don't see covered is Sarah's very important story in science about rising temperatures in southern waters. These are supposed to be extremely cold waters, and why it's just a fraction of a degree, that's a huge amount of heat for a large body of water. And those kind of stories, which may be longer it may be more important in the long run, you know, don't tend to get covered as much. Or with the malaria story, a year and a half later, that was reanalyzed, and it turned out a lot of that increase in malaria was not due to climate change, but was due to a diversion of public health monies away from malaria prevention towards AIDS. Not a single I mentioned that in a story, but not a single other newspaper covered that. So I think on one hand, you don't have a lot of the important things covered, and a lot of things you have a lot of the noise getting more attention than they deserve. And I've sort of started to almost convert my beat into one of climate change, which means I'm ignoring a lot of things NASA's doing and otherwise, but I think it's an important story. We now are in the midst of running a series on climate change in the Arctic, Antarctic, and mountain regions. You can find it latimes.com/vanishing ice. And I'm happy also to talk more about ways I think we can